So my name is Matthijs Bouw. Dit is Nick Pevsner, and we're colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania. And the reason we are collaborating is, and that's by means of introduction, I have a practice, One Architecture and Urbanism, who's very much focused on the resilient space, climate adaptation. We do most of the coastal protection work in Manhattan. We have a history as one of the co-leads of the Big U. And Nick here is my colleague at the Landscape Architecture Department at Penn, and he is the resident energy expert. And he's been doing an incredible amount of work on, let's say, the spatialization of energy. And about a year, 2 years ago, we started to have a conversation about how does, let's say, design for climate adaptation or climate resilience and climate mitigation, how does that intersect? What can we learn from each other? And maybe is there something in the Sandy experience of the stuff that we're discussing today that can be brought to the climate mitigation space, to the energy transition, where we're starting to see also a lot of conversations about contested spaces, about environmental justice, etc. So we teamed up together, and we'd like to show you a bit of that work that we are doing with, at the end, a sort of question about to you is like, what can we learn more or less from all the things that we're discussing here today? Once we start to think about that parallel huge problem to all the climate adaptation that we need to do, which is all the climate mitigation work that we need to do. And so we called our project New York Energy Futures. And we're doing that at Penn, sponsored by the Climate Center for Energy Policy, and a bit of help from my firm. And it starts with the simple fact that the energy transition is here. There's very ambitious state and city goals. A lot will happen in the next decade. And one of the things that you realize when you think about the energy transition is that much of that energy transition will be built in part on legacy energy infrastructure. We will be working with existing transmission lines. Maybe we'll be transitioning existing energy infrastructure sites, because you never build an entirely new system all at once. So the existing energy infrastructure will be very much part of that. And what you see, of course, here is that much of that energy infrastructure is in the flood zone. We also see a lot of environmental justice concerns there. Fortunately, there's a lot of frontline communities who also understand this and are part of that conversation. But in that process of this energy transition, we also have to undo many of the bad decisions we have made in the past. We see it's clear where the asthma rates are highest. It's clear where we've located our energy infrastructure that we have over the past centuries as we build out our energy infrastructures made a lot of mistakes. And so in a fundamental way, this transition is really messy. We know where we are coming from with a large mix of fossil fuels, and we know not exactly where we're going. We need to go to a very large percentage of renewables, but we don't know what the renewable mix is going to be. We don't know what the exact types of generation for those renewables are, but we also see that there's a lot of new actors in this space. It used to be that energy was done like by the big fossil fuel companies, as well as by the big utilities. But by now you have the private sector entering into that space. You have utilities at a much more local level. The city is starting to become more active, and city agencies are, and environmental justice community. So that means for us that new coalitions and new co-locations will need to be developed. And that's super interesting, and that immediately sort of points at a space where designers, we think, can play a role. And so our project is really about sort of understanding how that transition can take place, how it is spatialized, and what is the capacity of, let's say, our land and our communities to accommodate these energy transitions? What is the geography and capacity of the legacy fossil fuel energy infrastructure, but what is the opportunity to utilize these sites for new technologies? We want to understand better the capacity of grids and pipelines, because those are really going to form the backbone of that work, and understand the opportunities and bottlenecks on a sort of spatial level to help increase the deployment of renewables across this range of technologies. And there's a lot of cool stuff out there, and we started sketching. One of the things, of course, that we know is that offshore wind projects are looking for landing sites. Those have implications of where energy infrastructure is going to take place. We also see huge issues of inadequate transmission in outer boroughs where mostly people of color live. You see that there's frequent brownouts in those communities, much more than in, let's say, white communities. We are interested, as anyone else, in the renewable Rikers, but you can start to think, well, once you start to add these things, can you start to imagine new places for storage and transmission capacity, sketching some possibilities for maybe the Triborough Express corridor as a way to start drawing that. So with that, we started to realize that energy systems have different optimal scales, and we want to understand at what scales what energy systems can best work and what their spatial impacts is. This is more or less the introduction. Now Nick will start to present the first part of our research. It's very much a work in progress that we're doing at Penn with Kleiman and a bit with the office. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthias. Yeah, so we have a great team. Our research assistants have delved into the policy history and also kind of upcoming policy landscape for New York City at the city and state level, and then have begun spatializing some of these questions and looking for spatial opportunities. So for example, if we look at the geography, let's say, of the current power plants in New York City, some of them are already getting ready to close down because of recent nitrogen oxide emissions rules. So some of those sites are going to be targeted with big question marks. What happens once those power plants shut down? If we look at the exposure of power plant sites to climate threat, for example, for sea level rise, again, some of those sites are maybe facing retrofit or redevelopment. So we can slice the pie this way, looking at generating capacity across the different power plant sites in New York. We can also look at physical spatial footprint and start to imagine, okay, how much land is this? And if all these old dirty sites were open, for example, for public uses, that's potentially a lot of land, over 86 acres. And of course, we know that the location of this legacy fossil fuel infrastructure, as Matthias already said, is not equally sited. There's a predominant correlation of power plant sites with the 51 tracts from census where those power plants are located, impacting disproportionately people of color, 228,000 people, 40% or more people of color within those tracts. And we already see amazing work by environmental justice advocates like NAIJA and the rest of the Peak Coalition, pointing out, some of the systemic injustices in those siting processes that resulted in so many gas-fired peaker plants being sited in communities of color like Sunset Park. And so from there, we started to look a little bit more closely at a handful of these sites. So looking at power plants that are close to heat vulnerable areas, that are close to environmental justice communities, that are going to be affected by sea level rise, some of the biggest sites, and some of the highest capacity sites. And we started thinking about how we might play this out in scenarios. So when we're thinking about the energy transition, we're interested in where physically it would start to change the physical landscape of the city, how much land, how much power, how much energy storage, and then how just that that change would be. And so just looking, for example, at some of the feedback causal loops that we might consider, you know, right now there's this kind of feedback loop of as residents are increasingly depending on air conditioning and thermal controls to stay cool during hotter and hotter summers. That puts more and more strain on the energy grid. That energy grid kicks in with peaker plants during some of the worst air days already in the summer. Those are all getting more extreme in terms of extreme heat and weather events. And that's putting extra burdens both in terms of energy use and energy insecurity, and also in terms of air quality on the same group of residents. And so how do we start to kind of unpack some of those feedback loops and reroute some of the vulnerabilities? And then also, how do we start thinking spatially in terms of the different layers and infrastructural components of the overall system? So we can start to take scenarios and try to understand, okay, so if this is the grid mix, what is then the spatial footprint? What are the spatial changes, and where might those places be like, and how would they change? So just to very quickly introduce the three scenarios that we've established to try to dig into this question. Scenario one imagines a large-scale, very rapid electrification, relying on big, bulk, renewable energy producers. In the city, there's not a lot of land, so where are all of these facilities going to be sited? Probably somewhere in upstate New York, with offshore wind coming in to the Narrows, and then a lot of wind and solar in upstate. Somehow that power needs to get down to the city, and then the city can start to meet its local goals while the state meets its. We know that there's going to be bottlenecks in terms of how that power gets moved. So here, just digging into the kind of disparity in terms of renewables upstate versus downstate. New York City in load zone J is predominantly reliant on fossil fuel. And so where is that renewable energy going to come from? We also understand that the current transmission bottlenecks, in theory, this is how it gets solved, right? So Governor Hochul has announced 2 large-scale transmission projects, but we also know how contested transmission lines can be. So there's a lot riding on connecting those upstate renewable energy sources with downstate consumers. But what if the transmission gets blocked? What if there's land use challenges? What if it takes too long? What if this doesn't happen? What might happen in the city to still meet its carbon decarbonization goals? So with that, we write out a different scenario, which looks maybe at localized distributed action, also following an electrify everything, high electrification framework. So in this case, maybe the city and the utilities are moving too slowly to build its transmission lines. Maybe something happens with the offshore wind capacity, takes longer than expected. We don't know. But basically, in this scenario, communities are taking the lead, maybe with city support, to start to build local microgrids on land that is readily available. We also, in digging into this, are looking at how the grid is actually unevenly weak or strong. So there are these pockets of constrained capacity. So right now, Con Ed defines this as places that have too little remaining capacity to host new loads. And so if people get EVs, will they be able to plug in? If they install solar panels, will they be able to sell that power back to the grid and reap the financial benefits? So where are these constrained areas? And it's primarily, as Matthias said, in the outer boroughs. And can we think about what might happen in some of these communities? So with that, we think about different kinds of arrangements in places that are not going to be well served by the existing grid arrangement. And so we might think of components of a community-focused microgrid. We might map and quantify like what spatial opportunities exist in different neighborhoods for these different various types of components and different scales of solar deployment. and some kind of emerging interesting vehicle to grid, peer-to-peer, and other kinds of arrangements where it's not really all about the centralized grid as the main distribution. Looking at how much land is there actually? So we're starting to look at rooftop areas and also digging into case studies to start to understand the scale of historic deployments, how that might play out. There's a lot of roof area, but then also there's certain building typologies that are maybe able to host more, or maybe are more open to a more democratic form of ownership or cooperative arrangement. The third scenario considers, well, maybe there's a role if large, kind of medium scale actors emerge as the big leaders. So in this case, campuses and city-owned large sites, maybe hospitals, maybe university campuses, SUNY campuses, maybe it's city-owned buildings. How do they take the lead, and what might that look like? And in this scenario, we play out, what if it's not all electric, but actually other kinds of decarbonization pathways? So fuel switching, we can think of different forms of energy storage. We might think about thermal energy storage. We might think about renewable, locally sourced renewable gas production, hydrogen hubs, anaerobic digestion, et cetera. So what happens at the scale of a large campus that might start to reduce some of the grid demand on the rest of New York? And so looking at where some of those large campuses are, and really digging into public facilities that might be in the lead if the city emerges as a leader, or these large campuses if it goes private sector. Okay, so just to dig into one example, and one of those scenario one former legacy fossil fuel sites that are threatened both by closure, imminent closure from NOx rules, as well as sea level rise and climate vulnerability. We zoom in here on the Astoria generating station, which is facing closure from the new nitrous oxide emissions rules. And there's a fight over what is going to replace that natural gas plant. So we can break it down by its components. What is there now? There's some funny fragments in the arrangement. We can look at the ownership, and that might give us some clues as to what is possible where and how it might play out. But really, we're interested in the current generating capacity and how might that be replaced in an emissions-free form. So right now, the site is producing around 1,300 megawatts. So what if we replace that with battery storage, as has been proposed at other places like Ravenswood? How much land would that take? So looking at kind of a typical battery storage arrangement, this is the footprint that we get. And then the next question is, okay, if that's the game plan, where might this be deployed? How might it be deployed? And really, what does it open up then in terms of other opportunities for land use? So we know the site is quite exposed to flood and storm surge. So probably there's some role in coastal protection to make sure that the majority of the site is usable. If we take that square footage and pack it away this way, we might end up with all the rest of this white space for other uses. We could extend the neighborhood into the site. If we kind of assume an R6 zoning, this gives us roughly 10,000 units of housing.
Upgrade the wastewater treatment. When you add
That's
10,000 houses?
Yeah, that is a great question, and so we can talk about kind of like co-locations and maybe benefits of yeah. So that's obviously going to be a constraint.
In the water demand, like what is the water infrastructure? I know
Right.
where this site is.
Right.
The map you're showing is also in my brain.
Great.
Like where's the water infrastructure to feed another 10,000 houses and like to cool batteries and those sort of
Right.
systems?
So yeah, right now this is a pretty back of the envelope kind of spatial arrangement, but I think those are exactly the kinds of next much more granular questions we'd want to ask. Yeah.
It's also deep water accessible. Meaning you can ship up the Hudson, which is the arm of the ocean, or out to the sea. And the same is true on the wrong side of the river, which was why the Hunts Point Market was created there. That has never been serviced by the water and has never had proper service by rail, which exists over there.
So amazing opportunities for other kinds of multifunctionality and
Because it's
co-location.
not
Right?
all a matter of,
Yeah.
flooding coming.
Exactly.
This is not deep water here. This is hard to navigate into. That's why you see in the upper left corner, that's a dock for a ship.
Mhm.
It's out like several hundred feet into the river, and you have a max draft that's about 12 feet there.
Mhm.
When you talk deep water, we're talking 30 feet. You should.
The general area.
Can we, this
Okay.
is fantastic.
Sorry.
Can you identify yourself so then we can follow up with you?
I will follow up with you. I'm so interested
Okay.
in this. Is like great thinking here.
But so, I mean, I think just for now, for instance, the opportunity for maybe rethinking some of the monofunctional fossil fuel energy generation and thinking about other opportunities for actually multifunctional, co-located, and multi-use rearrangements of the sites, and then kind of just looking at, okay, what does that mean in terms of raw area, and then not even digging into some of the performance attributes like you were saying. And then also, how does this start to play into other patterns? So for example, we understand that there's an unevenness in open space access, for example. So how do we rethink these legacy energy sites to maybe address some other equity goals? And so just coming back to the larger collection of sites, we're testing out this kind of a thinking and seeing how much of it is applicable generally and how much of it is extremely site specific and kind of needs to be taken kind of on a site by site basis. But in general, I guess our thesis for the conversation is that the energy transition is not merely a technical, economic, or regulatory problem, but is a spatial problem, and that design can, should, and will play, we would propose, a critical role in linking some of these disparate actors as well as some of these different systems, and not kind of assume that there's just one pathway that that is going to result. And so with that, I think we wanted to open it up for a larger conversation in terms of what lessons from everything that's been going on in the other sessions and downstairs, from the 10 years of learning from the experience with climate adaptation, can we take into the conversation around the energy transition?
Is that a question?
That's a question too.
I would say, for scenario two, I believe was the battery storage option. You definitely want a flood-proof battery storage facility. I would even think of like a concrete shell in place.
Or elevated,
Yeah, or elevated.
or multifunctional as zoning rules and building codes start to change. Yep.
But could you tell me a bit more based on sort of what experience you are very concerned about that?
The risk of a storm event and power outage.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so, a storm event would actually bring the water level above sea level.
Yeah.
Sea level's already rising,
Mhm.
and so not even a hurricane can produce some level of considerable damage.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you definitely want to have a state of the art flood proof and water flow design.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really good, right? So like in this initial sort of sketch, and we say, well, once you start to rethink your land use on these sites, you can probably pay for a pretty high level flood protection infrastructure.
Yeah.
But building in the redundancy is always critical, right? Because one of the things that we have learned is that systems can fail, and you need to build your system such that they are safe to fail and that you have backup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some questions, is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, please, questions.
Number one, nuclear and hydroelectric power. Do you see that?
I see it upstate.
I see you see that state. Okay. So nuclear is okay, politically
Yeah, I mean, it's a big discussion with people who are in the climate space, right? What nuclear can do uh, for the climate crisis or should not do. I think there's slowly a consensus that at least keeping existing nuclear operational seems like a smart move. The climate crisis and
Until renewable capacity can actually catch up.
until the renewable capacity can catch up. There's much more reluctance about building new nuclear. I think one is that those projects are costly, take a lot of time, and they divert us from what we fundamentally need to do is to speed up the delivery of renewables.
Another question is about hydrogen.
Yeah.
Mhm.
What's the current status of the technology and in terms of intellectual property, the law and everything, like how do you see the future in hydrogen?
Hydrogen. So there's a big push with the Inflation Reduction Act on hydrogen hubs, right? And so the siting and implementation of that is very much, being written now, I would argue. But I think we're fairly agnostic into, choosing one pathway over another, but just playing out, okay, so if hydrogen, where would it be located? Would it be, or could it be sited on some of these same legacy sites? And if so, what does that preclude for other uses? Or, what is the limits on capacity based on area or based on safety or based on setbacks or kind of other parts of the system? In general, the potential of hydrogen, right? There's the rainbow of hydrogen, gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and green hydrogen. And so each of those hydrogen forms has different politics, different costs, different regulatory, different, social buy-in. I think green hydrogen folks are fairly on board with. So green hydrogen produced by electrolysis powered by renewable energy could be a good way to store excess renewable energy. Gray hydrogen is bad because it has emissions associated with it, and blue hydrogen uses CCS, which is problematic and kind of complicated for a lot of reasons, although people come down on how necessary it might actually be. So long story short, I think we imagine there's spatial questions to hydrogen anyway, like where would it play out, and B, like there are technical questions to be resolved, such as how much does it prop up or replace or repurpose existing infrastructure, and who does that benefit or the opposite.
Thank you.
Can I ask, has it ever been employed to solve like multiple problems at once, where you have effluent from like a natural gas power plant, and you can actually use that effluent to isolate the hydrogen through technologies that you essentially will react carbon dioxide with water vapor. And you can literally start to generate hydrogen for hydrogen fuel cells at natural gas power.
Can I give a broader question? Because I don't know the specific answer to the question that you have, but I'm interested in the question because what I think we have learned in the resilience space is that we want to, for instance, use design to integrate these type of questions, right? And that there's what today we talk about is all the challenges that brings for governments or people working in silos. And I think the argument that we would like to make, and as we progress with this research, is that a sort of similar effort at integration, at looking at these problems holistically, at engaging communities in the conversation about these and working through multiple agencies and stakeholders is going to be really critical. So I'm really happy with the type of question that you asked, because really that's the type of point that we're making.
The environmental justice advocates would love that idea.
Yeah.
And the only thing I would add, because I agree, is then with something like tacking on a new industrial process onto an existing industrial process, is there something about that existing industrial process that is conveying benefits or burdens unevenly? And if so, does supporting that industry put extra or additional burdens in a concentrated way? With natural gas, that is the argument of the Peak Coalition, right? which is why I think there's a lot of other, I don't know, other questions like, okay, so then are you then also adding scrubbing technology for air quality?
Yeah, that would-
And if not, that's, so there's these other variables, which are not spatial variables, they're more like investment regulatory variables, and political.
Anything that's using fresh water in its process is taking that fresh water out of the system for either direct human consumption or indirect through agriculture and fisheries. And it's irreplaceable. The fracking sector produces something with its chemical additives called produced water, which they do not serve at their cocktail parties.
Not unless they
The-
want an extra arm.
The nuclear sector uses that to cool.
Yeah.
When you do, and the costs are going down to desalinate, those are going down. There is the problem of the saline waste, the same as, which has no theoretical use now, the same as there's no way to deal with nuclear waste right
Yeah.
now. And those remaining plants have the problem, which was the case of Indian Point, of they reached their limited utility. The plant's reactor vessel was failing metallurgically, and the engineers did not know why. In addition to being on the top of an active fault line, and the state allowing a high-pressure gas pipeline to go underneath. So it was the worst of all cases in that. So unfortunately, those things have to be considered as well.
Sure.
Oh, and the last thing with nuclear, it is not, you said they're costly. Nowhere on the planet Earth is it insured by the private sector. It's all government.
Yep.
Because there's no actuary
Yep.
who could figure out a safe condition for it.
Thank you.
I just wondered in your dynamic model, if you're considering, as New York State and others, to transition to electric-only cars as part of your battery inputs and spatial inputs?
Yeah.
Because there's a obvious benefit to that, to your model. And the other one is proliferation of geothermal and how that changes load quantities
Yeah.
as self-produced power or load generation, and how that
Yeah.
impacts your models.
So in terms of EVs and electrification more broadly, so transitioning heating also to electric. So in scenarios 1 and 2, those are the high electricity scenarios. So we assume that's what would happen. And in that case, energy demand goes up. So there's a higher budget to replace either upstate in scenario 1 or locally in scenario 2. So
But it's also one of the reasons we are in this research so far working with scenarios, right? Like there's a lot of uncertainty.
exactly.
For instance, one of the projects that we are also working on is to implement amplified thermal energy systems, which is a very common system
For thermal
in the Netherlands,
storage.
where you use your aquifer as a battery with a cold well and a hot well. And that doesn't really happen here. There's a lot of regulatory hurdles as well as other hurdles. But one of the things they do in the Netherlands is they have underground zoning. They have zoning for their aquifers to make sure that those cold wells and hot wells are sited appropriately and don't interfere with each other. And like, will we ever have underground zoning in New York City? Maybe, but that's where this initial hypothesis, like this transition is messy. There's so much stuff we don't know. And so that's where, like, constantly doing dynamic models and working with scenarios and exploring all the different opportunities is so important, because we do know that we have a climate crisis going on. So we need to throw everything we have at this problem.
What about low density, like upstate areas, rural areas, where it might be hard to invest because you don't have critical mass of customers? What do you think that scenario would be?
Yeah, so that's what's happening within the single first scenario, right? And that is something that is policy within the state of New York, is that they really want to use the Western New York for siting of energy infrastructure. And then the question that they have is, how do we get it to the cities? And how do we deal with variances in load demand and in generation capacity? So that's where, in these scenarios, for instance, the need for all these batteries coming. We need, top of my head, about 6. They calculated we need about 6 gigabytes of batteries in order to make sure that they can get that system to work. So the question is, where is that site? One of the things that you also then need to take into account, what are the environmental justice concerns for basically extracting those, using those rural communities as an extractive resource to sort of power our cities. And so I think you raise a lot of questions that I don't have an answer to, but that I think that are, in the same way as we're having these difficult conversations about climate adaptation, we need to have those conversations about climate mitigation, but if we don't have them, we won't succeed in making the transition.
To build on that next question, and you might just say I don't have the answer, but I was thinking the same thing about the battery storage and the conversations that are having about lithium and lithium extraction.
Yeah.
Was that just your, like, or did you two,
I have lots of
with it?
I have lots of thoughts about it. They are not kind of reflected in the spatial questions that are being asked about the kind of the site of New York City is primarily the site of consumption as opposed to the site of production for battery storage. The sites of production are the Atacama Desert in Chile and the future coast of Greenland and maybe the offshore deep sea. So there's like all of these other lithium frontiers that are going to be necessary for extraction to power the energy storage in the global north primarily. So there are scholars that spend a lot of time thinking about that. I'm thinking of Thea Riofrancos and her work, anthropology work in Chile with I think it's called the transnational, plurinational lithium observatory. And I think so conceptually, my answer is like, we should be wise in where we use our lithium. And then there's also going to be trade-offs, as with anything in the renewable energy transition.
And there's,
what are we
there's conceptually also that for the thread on Twitter, like, this is probably the last day we're going to use Twitter, right? So, but at least like in the last week, there was one which sort of dimensioned the spatial impact of lithium mining in relation to the spatial impact of coal mining. And once you start to, like, and we need to do better, right, at lithium mining, but we also need to really stop coal mining.
Yeah, so it's like, what's your counterfactual, and then 2, kind of like, what are the environmental impacts and labor impacts and kind of other social impacts, and how do you kind of trace those things through a supply chain? And to that end, the transparency of supply chains becomes really important, because if you can't source ethically produced lithium in Bolivia instead of maybe unethically produced lithium from Nevada, then you have no agency as a government that's doing procurement, or as a private company that's doing just purchasing. So yeah, I think those are great questions. I mean, my mind immediately goes to like all the stuff we are putting batteries into that don't need to have batteries in them, and also the kind of, again, employing scenario thinking, but not in a quantitative way, like just imagining in America full of 300,000 EV Hummers versus an America full of Proterra EV buses, right? And how the same amount of material can go on. Also, Thea has pointed to the need for Thea Riofrancos to close supply chains so that we're not, so we're moving more from a pass-through economy where a battery is used once, discarded, those materials are really hard or expensive to repurpose, and if the market doesn't have a case for repurposing those materials, they go in the landfill until they do become valuable enough. And so instead, how actually there can be models, A, to regulate more of a circular flow for rare earths, and B, kind of once that battery is no longer good for your EV Hummer, it can still be pretty good when bundled together to serve as long duration storage or short duration storage for utility. So there's kind of ways of reusing batteries after they no longer serve their most energy dense function.
Another studio project.
So it's so fascinating. Yes.
Are you modeling storage that's not battery storage?
We are modeling thermal storage, and we are modeling hydrogen as a alternative kind of fuel storage. You know, so you can think about energy storage in a variety of ways. We're not modeling.
We don't want it any, no,
Okay,
we're not there yet.
I'm thinking flywheels and ice too.
And there's so yeah, storage. You can list 10 different technologies that all store energy, kinetic, chemical, right, physical. Pumped hydro storage, I love it because there's a long history of landscape architects engaging with dam construction and spatial planning for its goods and ills, but permitting a pumped hydro storage facility is typically a decade-long process with a lot of uncertainty and potential veto points along the way.
I was applying to New York City. Pumped hydrogen's not happening.
No, pumped hydroelectric.
Hydro is
Yeah,
not-
exactly. So, and then some of these forms are more relevant to New York City. So potentially, how does offshore wind play into it? You know, does it get coupled with firm storage of one kind or another? Pumped air. So I think we can go down the rabbit hole of technologies for sure. And flywheels. Yeah.
And I also wanted to emphasize a key aspect of energy intervention as building energy efficiency. And so,
Yes.
just as much as renewable technology can bring capacity to the grid,
Yep.
Energy efficiency savings and demand response can actually add capacity to the
Mm-hmm.
grid,
Mm-hmm.
both through human behavior and technologies.
Yep.
And there's specific technologies such as heat pump technologies that are available now that can significantly reduce the amount of electricity that are consumed in buildings and carbon emissions.
Yep.
And that's important in New York City because 70% of carbon emissions come from buildings.
The challenge, of course, with heat pumps and their fantastic technology is that they replace gas.
Yes.
So
Creates a new
they
peak.
add electricity demand, which not every neighborhood can accommodate.
Yeah.
And so, and there's a discrepancy there, and that really leads to, so in the scenario two, we really say, because there may be the scenario one, which is a centralized energy infrastructure, doesn't mediate that discrepancy between the energy rich and the energy poor neighborhoods.
Or energy
But a
secure
much
and
more
energy
energy
insecure.
secure but a more decentralized model, and especially when you then start to think about locally owned or something like that, could actually do that. So that's really very much the driver of the second scenario that we didn't much get into today.
And
I have one new question, or no?
Oh,
please,
yeah,
go ahead,
well,
yeah. And then if we have time, the gentleman in the.
No, I was just curious, you alluded to the closure of other power plants, and are you thinking that sort of like more designs like the one you showed us today are going to be necessary at those locations, or repurposing of those sites for other energy storage or projects?
I think we see it as for every site that is slated to close, it opens up a big question mark of what happens there. And so the kind of the methodology that we're showing for Astoria could be played out in any one of these sites, and we're doing that.
But there's another big argument in our research, is like this stuff it's a public project. This is public space design that we're talking about. This is stuff that we all share. And we need to start having a conversation about this transition as a public project, with all the challenges that come with it, because we now see that private actors who, let's say, by your side would probably do great stuff on that. Like maybe good stuff can happen on Ravenswood, but I feel that fundamentally these conversations, as we hear, are broader conversations, and we need to look at them much more from a public perspective and from the the public responsibility of driving those conversations.
Okay, one other question I had earlier was if Con Ed and NYPA are the ones that own that land, or is it owned by
We
the
don't.
city?
Sorry, we're talking about which,
Yeah,
The-
sorry,
the
yeah,
project
sorry,
yeah.
in New York.
well,
Go
so,
ahead. Yes.
They provide energy transmission. All over the country, the transmission and generation were split. So Con
Right.
Ed ceased to have power plants, the New York Power Authority, a public entity ceased to have power plants. They purchased that. They could invest in it, and they should have the incentives to do that, obviously, in the renewals. You know, that's a matter of beefing that up. But my other thoughts, one of it, another thing is tidal power. If you're looking into that and where there's a tiny experiment on Roosevelt Island that almost nobody knows about.
2 turbines.
The water pumping was, became a site on the Hudson of the Storm King project, because essentially the Hudson corridor is a treasured visual corridor that wherever it can be protected, it's protected.
Yeah.
The long transmission of hydropower, it sort of makes sense if there's no environmental damage to where it's going to. In this case, is coming from Quebec. And again, you're dealing with an indigenous problem and the fight between First Canadians and the province of Quebec. And that's through with the entire lithium resource in the Western Hemisphere is all indigenous.
Yeah, you're pointing out that every technology comes with trade-offs. Yeah. Yeah.
That's time.
And we are at
It's time,
time.
right? Yeah.
Well, thank
you
you
for your
all
inputs and your
for
questions.
wonderful questions and great conversation, and please feel free to get in touch.